This is autumn of 1999. The last letter was basically poems from and filled up most of the letter. This is a letter a month later that I meant to write, I guess. It's fall in southeast Fresno. Autumn, my favorite season. Summer here is relentless, day after day, until month after month of cloudless, dingy skies with hot and hotter temperatures. Then, one morning, the air is thick and sweet with color, while the color that had been washed out in bright glare now stands out in mellow light. And Saturday morning recently was just that beautiful. Everyone was asleep except me and the dog, so the day's chores went on hold, and I wheeled out the bicycle. I threw a treat to the dog, and I set off to savor the moment. Rolling east on Liberty Street, my breath puffs of vapor. I feel good. Earmuffs and gloves take all the sting out of the air, and I'm old and curmudgeonly enough to not care and even enjoy how uncool the earmuffs look. The first few blocks from home are lined with liquid amber trees, famed for fall colors and deserving of the fame. Today, leaves have turned purple, flame red, pure orange, and all shades from deep green through yellows to heart's blood red, dappled from tree to tree, so striking that it comes to me, I'm actually marveling. That was marvelous. 2 blocks more and I'm at a weekly swap meet, so I dismount and walk through. There are many Asian and Latino immigrant vendors and shoppers, as well as Americans of many varieties, and the hurly-burly and hugger-mugger is spice for my autumn morning ride. I stroll, aloof but joyful. I'm not interested in dealing, but I'm happy to see the crowd living their lives. Past the swap meet, I swing back to the saddle and I cruise along empty early morning streets. I'm glad simply to be, and a memory of a Wallace Stevens poems come to me. This is called A Clear Day and No Memories. No soldiers in the scenery, no thoughts of people now dead as they were 50 years ago, young and living in the live air, young and walking in the sunshine, bending in blue dresses to touch something. Today, the mind is not part of the weather. Today, the air is clear of everything. It has no knowledge except of nothingness, and it flows over us without meaning, as if none of us had ever been here before and are not now, in this shallow receptacle, this invisible activity, this sense. Of course, that poem evokes memories that are the negation of the title, and I begin to think of ways to write to you and this letter. I've never done a letter at this time of year before because holidays and birthdays and anniversaries come one after another, and often mid-October through January since our first child was born. But times change, the kids are grown, and my mom moved, so I have time to fill this year. About a mile out, I come to a railroad track that is sort of a rural bike path hidden in the city, and I follow it east. Soon I have to hug the rails, riding on the gravel ballast next to the ties, because the land between 2 apartment complexes and the rails has been almost completely filled with squatter farms of Hmong families. I've been riding these rails for many years, before even there were apartments, and I have watched the gardens multiply behind fences made out of old tires and bed springs and other urban jetsam strung together with wire and hoses until there remains only a single file pathway by the tracks. The many small plots are tended year-round with great variety of plants and active recycling, and there is a sense of industry, pleasure, and love that pleases me. I'm relishing bouncing over the gravel, happy to pay a price for this wonderful use of Fresno, and then I'm remembering a bus ride from years before. We left Cusco, Peru, on the bus for Nazca on the Pan American Highway on the other side of the Andes. Cusco had been home of the Inca, child of the sun, and capital of a huge pre-Columbian empire, and there are many wondrous things to see and taste and hear, but all of it above 11,000 feet elevation. We had been at that altitude or higher since riding a train into the high plains of Bolivia a couple of weeks earlier. We'd stayed a bit in La Paz and crossed Lake Titicaca and walked to the ruins of Machu Picchu. We had roamed the monstrous stones of the Incan fortress above Cusco and the stones of the Colonial Plaza and the cobbled streets of the town, and I came to realize that I am a valley boy. I longed to get closer to sea level, and I was glad to be on the bus. Our plan was to travel straight through, saving the expense of a night's lodging by sleeping as the bus rolled through the night, so that when we reached Nazca at 6 the next morning, we could grab a few provisions and immediately put our thumbs out on the Pan American Highway so as to reach Lima before nightfall. The bus rolled across more or less level land, beginning in green watered fields that became more and more desiccated until by the time we turned west in the afternoon, following a rushing mountain river up canyon, the land is almost barren. The road now is 2 lanes with no shoulders, tortuously following the steep canyon walls, and our bus and a car collide on a sharp inside curve. Neither vehicle is too badly damaged to continue, but all parties, except for us passengers, insist that we wait for the authorities to make a report. The accident happened on a hairpin turn where a small feeder creek has cut back into the canyon wall, and although the canyon is too steep and arid for much more than rocks and an occasional cactus, there's a small cultivated plot on the flat below the road. Killing time, Rick and I walk up road to where some prickly pears with ripe tunas have caught our eyes, and we carefully clean and eat a few. When we return to the bus, the rest of the passengers, almost every one, have formed a bucket brigade and are passing watermelons hand to hand from the farmer's field up the embankment and onto the bus. I was at once appalled because the farmer's life here had to be hard enough without having a busload of thieves break down in your yard. But I was also appreciative of the organization, industry, and pleasure of the stranded wayfarers. After a few hours, we were back on the road, and by dusk we were in deep purple shadows of the narrow head of the canyon, almost at the level of the foaming torrent, and we passed a boy of 10 or so walking downriver along the road, carrying a trout by the gills. The head is at his shoulders, and the tail is at his feet. What a fish! And there are no house or even any vegetation visible for miles, and I still wonder where he's going and what it would be like to fish that wild river. I want to remind you here that we left the town at 11,000 feet above sea level and have been traveling upriver from there for hours. Sometime after dark, we topped out on a high plain and we stopped at an inn. There must be a town too, but it's too cold and dark to explore, and we stay inside to drink coffee with the bread and cheese we bought the day before. The bus we had been riding turned back, and we board a different bus and find the only seats open are at the very back, where the last side window pane is missing. The cold of dark night at 14,000 feet is thin and sharp, and we try to seal the pneumonia hole, but the bus begins rolling and there's no blocking the wind. I put on all the clothes I have and I huddle in the thin cotton quilting that passes for a sleeping bag and endure, but not only the fierce cold. The bus is like an old Bluebird school bus, bought used after years of abuse by children had worn it out, and the road itself has been beaten by the altitude and traffic into a washboard surface, and the combination makes the back seat like riding a jackhammer. Nonetheless, I have grown up in the shadow of the Sierra Nevada of California, almost in sight of Mount Whitney, the highest point in the lower 48, and I had had a vain, silly, and proprietary pride in its lofty height, topping out at over 14,000 feet above the sea. But traveling that night until dawn, I was always higher than the peak of Mount Whitney. Cold, yes. Uncomfortable, yes. But I have that memory and this. When light creeps from the east, just enough to distinguish the road from the roadside, we leave the gravel washboard that had tortured the night and begin a twisting down canyon descent. As there is just enough light to pick out colors, the bus slows to crawl through a herd of colorful llamas with drovers clad in tasseled hats and hand-woven colorful gear. Then, as the sun crests the jagged Sierra behind and begins to turn the sky into a golden glow, the bus turns the corner and we are on the edge of the world. It's breathtaking. We are near the top of the escarpment of the Andes, rising sheer from the Pacific Ocean, and there is nothing to the west but vast distance. 12,000 feet or so of fiery haze of welcoming, warming sun. If we hadn't been involved in the watermelon thievery the day before, we would have made this descent in the dark, so arriving at Nazca at noon instead of 6 a.m. As planned is a bargain that pays off again when, once we are in town, we get offered a night in the desert, but that's for a different letter. Meanwhile, back on the bike and miles beyond the Hmong Gardens, I laugh to think that the letter has gone from a clear day and no memories to a memoir. I'm not going to let logic interfere with enjoyment, though, and that makes me think of a Zen story about a cook in a monastery who, while gathering vegetables for supper in the kitchen garden, inadvertently gathers in a small snake too, and stews it with the vegetables in the pot. The monks, vegetarians all, find the soup delicious, but the snake's head is in the master's bowl, and he summons the cook, and holding up the piece of snake, he demands, "What's this?" And the cook grabs it and pops it in his mouth and says, "Delicious?" Well, that's it from Liberty Street. With peace and love, Eric.